Hello. Today we're going to be talking about Russia's three revolutions, which took place between 1917 and 1945, and ultimately saw the leadership of the four men you see on this screen. This is a second picture of Joseph Stalin, who will end up leading Russia for the duration of this period. We begin in 1894, when Russia crowned a new monarch named Nicholas II. Who is he, and what type of leader was he? Well, Nicholas II inherited the Russian title of Tsar, which means Caesar in Russian. And this was the title that had been held by his family, the Romanovs, since the year 1613. But unlike his father, the harsh and popular Alexander III, Nicholas was not a charismatic leader. He was a shy, quiet man. He lived the life of a private, wealthy monarch, traveling from the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to his various summer homes in provinces with his family. Nicholas II preferred the company of his family and his close associates to the cosmopolitan world of nobles and generals and ambassadors. Nicholas's wife, the Tsarina, seen here in the bottom left photo, was named Alexandra. She was considered overbearing by many of the Tsar's ministers and leading nobles, who felt she had too much influence over the Tsar. Now, the Tsarina and the Tsar shared 5 children, 4 daughters, as seen in the upper middle picture, and 1 son, Alexei, seen on the top right. Alexei, the only son, was ill. And Alexei had a condition called hemophilia. Now, hemophilia is when your blood doesn't clot. And so a relatively minor issue, like a scrape or a cut, has the potential to turn fatal if it is not treated quickly. And really, the treatment around the turn of the century was not very progressive. The problem is that a cut will continue to bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed. And instead of stopping and then scabbing over, the wound will stay open and active. This can lead to the loss of too much blood and then can turn fatal as a result. So the Tsar and his wife were very preoccupied with poor Alexei's medical condition, particularly because Alexei was the heir to the throne. As the son, the male heir, it would be he who would be Tsar next, and they needed to protect him as best, of course, as they could. Now, back to the Tsar. Nicholas II naively believed that Russia faced no serious threats to its stability from inside the empire. Because of his strong Orthodox faith and his confidence in the long tradition of the Romanov dynasty, Nicholas felt that the state would continue to rule itself without problems, just as it had for his father, his grandfather, his great-grandfather for the last 300 years. Nicholas II liked to avoid political involvement as much as he could, allowing his ministers instead to deal with most affairs of state. Nicholas felt that dissent in Russia was limited to just a few radicals who he believed should be dealt with quickly and harshly. The Tsar believed that all Russians loved him as their, quote, little father, which was the Tsar's traditional nickname. But Nicholas was alienated from the reality of Russian life. You see, most Russians, not just radicals, were dissatisfied with Russian society and with the Tsarist regime. They felt that Nicholas's less than charismatic personality and love of conservative Russian political systems were central to Russia's problems. So, despite his optimism, Russia's political situation was indeed terribly unstable. There were several things that the Russian people wanted. What I am about to say does not relate to the slide you're looking at, so listen to my words as opposed to focusing on the slide. Many Russians wanted change. For example, many middle-class liberals wanted a democratic constitution to give them rights and break the traditional hold on power held by the Russian nobility. Repressed national minorities wanted independence. This is that nationalism we have talked about in previous units, wherein the peoples are nationalistic for themselves and wanting independence from the empire that controls them. Russia, a massive empire, had several groups of people who sought independence from that empire, including, for example, the Poles, the Ukrainians, and the Lithuanians. Landless peasants were another group that called for sweeping social changes by seeking land that they could farm. Likewise, workers were demanding better working conditions and the right to form labor unions. Nicholas II, who remember did not tolerate dissent, gave his secret police complete freedom to persecute liberals, peasants, minorities, and workers who were attempting to change Russia's outdated social and political systems. In addition to these domestic problems, there were international problems, and that is related to the slide you see in front of you. Remember that in the late 1800s, European countries were seeking colonies in Asia and in Africa. Well, Russia saw itself as a major European power and did not want to be left out of that expansion. And so the Tsar commissioned the construction of a railway that would link the western, more European regions of his empire with the eastern, more Asian portions of his empire. This railroad was called the Trans-Siberian Railway, and Nicholas II hoped that it would indeed solidify his empire. However, the construction of this railway did bring Russia into conflict with an Asian country who was expanding in their own right across Asia. And that country is Japan. So as the railroad links the Russian Empire, Japan begins to feel threatened, particularly due to their interests in China. As a result of these feelings of threat, Japan launches a surprise attack on Russia in 1904. Ultimately, a war breaks out, and this war lasts from 1904 to 1905. Russia loses not only their Pacific fleet in that surprise attack, but also their European fleet, right, who they had sailed around to the eastern seaboard of their country to engage with Japan, and Japan sank that fleet as well. This was an incredibly humiliating defeat. The Russians lost to the Japanese. And this was particularly humiliating because the Russians saw themselves as European. And as you are aware, the prevailing attitudes of the time were that Europeans were superior to all other peoples of the world, including Asians. So when this Russian European country is defeated by what was believed to be an inferior Asian country, it was particularly embarrassing. The pathetic handling of this war by the Tsar and his ministers exposed the government's inefficiency and their corruption. And as a result, many people who had favored the Tsar now began to question the old system, and they realized that Tsar Nicholas II was ineffective and was indeed out of touch with Russia's many problems. So in January of 1905, a Russian Orthodox priest named Father Capone leads a peaceful march of workers to the Tsar's winter palace. These workers were carrying religious banners and portraits of the royal family. Others were praying, led again by a priest. The workers' intention was to deliver to the Tsar a petition. And that petition described the hardships of their lives and asked for the Tsar to make changes, such as the creation of a constitution, the right for them to form unions, and to improve working conditions of workers across Russia. Most of these workers had heard radical claims that the Tsar's regime was to blame for their poor living conditions, but they still believed that the Tsar would protect and help them. But on this Sunday, the Tsar was not at the palace. Instead, the marchers encountered the palace guards who formed defensive positions in front of the palace gates. Although the workers were unarmed, the guards probably feared that they were going to try to revolt. And so the guards opened fire. And in the ensuing chaos, several hundred to a couple of thousand people were killed or wounded. The numbers here are vague. So somewhere between a couple hundred up to perhaps 2,000 die. The massacre becomes known as Bloody Sunday. And it sparks a violent, destructive series of riots and revolts throughout Russia that are collectively referred to as the 1905 Revolution. Now, news of Bloody Sunday spread quickly across Russia, and violent outbursts aimed at symbols of the Tsar and his guards and soldiers erupted across the country. For instance, workers went on strike, soldiers and sailors mutinied, and peasants burned and looted the holdings of nobles. The widespread, spontaneous nature of the revolution reflected the deep-seated resentment and frustration that existed in all segments of Russian society. Unorganized revolts rose and fell across the countryside off and on until the fall. Ultimately, the 1905 revolution succeeded in completely stopping the normal daily life in Russia for about 10 days. But it was not successful in changing any of the conditions that brought about the revolution to begin with. These pictures here will change to modern-day pictures of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. This ends our first segment of the Russian Revolution series.